Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Or hello. That's one of the things that I get asked very, very often, I'm sure many artists get asked this, is how do you paint insert material here? Want to learn how to paint skin or something? Huh? You weirdo? Well, you working on your D&D commission? You just can't get the skin to look right? Oh, that's too bad. Oh, what a bummer. I don't know, maybe it's plastic. Can you not paint plastic? Do you not know how to paint that? I mean, cardboard, wood, any rocks. Oh, don't even get me started on rocks. Well, you came to the right place. Or not, I don't know. I don't know how helpful this will be. So this is the ultimate how to render video. If you want to render X, you want to render Y, doesn't matter. You can do it by watching this and just, copying the stuff that I copied from other people that are better than me, and copied from other people that were better than them, and they probably learned it back in the Renaissance era or some shit. But before I hop over to the computer and I kind of show you exactly what I'm talking about, I feel like I need to say this in every single video that I make at this point. Thank you everybody who has liked, subscribed all my latest videos now that I've been kind of getting back into YouTube. I really appreciate it. A lot of people liked my last video of kind of my art journey, of my upbringing, and how I got into becoming a full-time artist. So thank you. Anyway, let's get to painting materials. So, all right, we're here. What are we talking about? What's this crazy person talking about? How you can paint any material in any which way that you want. So what we're going to be talking about today is this sphere here. What we're going to be discussing is what's called the form principle. Now, the form principle is a universal truth of how light interacts with objects. Now, there are differences between objects, and we're going to get into what those differences are. But first, we have to establish what the form principle is and why it's so important for everybody to know. So, you look at an object, you have this sphere here, right? What are the different elements of the lighting? First of all, the most basic is the separation between light and shadow. So obviously, shadow side, light side. Pretty easy to follow so far. Now, that separation between light and shadow actually has a name, and that's called the terminator. Now, between light and shadow, there's also unique parts of those as well. On the light side, you have the highlight, the center light, and the halftone. Now, on the shadow side, you have what's considered the core shadow. You have reflected light. And another aspect of shadow, but it's a little bit more complicated, is the ambient occlusion. There's actually one other part that I won't count towards the shadow side of the object, and that's just the cast shadow. It's not technically part of the object, but it derives from it. And that's it. That's every part of every object ever. But in order to get differences between different materials, you have to be able to understand what aspects of materials change. So one by one, I'm going to be going through each of these terms, and I'm going to be explaining to you exactly what they are and what function they serve. So highlight, that's pretty simple. Most people understand what a highlight is, but they don't totally understand how to draw it exactly. A highlight is the reflection of the light source shining down on that object. What's important to consider here, though, is that the highlight is movable. The highlight moves depending on the angle that you view the object, and it's because it's a reflection of the light source. It is not actually part of the object itself, in a way. Next, we have the center light. Now, the center light is probably what most people would kind of end up painting the highlight when they first start. The center light is the majority of the light that is hitting the object. It is the bulk of the object being hit by the full strength of the light before it starts dissipating at all. Now, the halftone is probably the hardest thing for artists to get a grasp of. The halftone is the part of the object that starts receding further down in the value scale and starts darkening, but it hasn't totally reached the terminator or the cutoff between light and shadow. It takes a little bit of practice to start seeing and identifying where that cutoff between light and shadow is. It's also kind of difficult to see where the center light ends and the halftone begins. Now, there is, in a way, kind of a science to this, but really, over time, you can just eyeball this and it's pretty effective. So to get into the shadow side of things, the core shadow, that's just the bulk of the shadow, meaning that it's the shadow that is being least affected by the light. Sort of. We'll get into that. Next, you have reflected light. Now, reflected light is technically another light source. So similarly to highlights, it is a reflection of it. So reflected light will actually also adjust depending on the angle that you view the object at. It's important to remember that reflected light is not always visible on an object. It's normally visible for most things on Earth. Now, what's required for the reflected light to show up is it requires some sort of an object that is receiving light to essentially have enough intensity of light to bounce back up and shine into another part of that object. In this example, the light source is shining past the ball here, and it's just bright enough that it's lighting the ground up, and that ground is then in turn lighting the back of the ball. Then you get into ambient occlusion. So ambient occlusion only occurs when there is an absolute removal of light. And that happens from two objects that are essentially very, very close to each other. And what happens is as those two objects get close to each other, like this ball and the ground, it starts to pinch the light in a way. The light can't go in and penetrate underneath the space here between the ball and the ground. And so the shadow starts darkening. So technically, this is going to probably be darker than the core shadow, but it only exists when the object is, up against another object. And then the cast shadow. And the cast shadow is pretty straightforward. It's the direction that the light is, shining down on this object. Where does that light begin and end in, place of that object? And wherever that is, that's the cast shadow. So that's putting these in the simplest, definitions and terms that I possibly could. Obviously, it takes a lot more practice to actually build this type of thing up. So I'm going to kind of show you how you build an object up, keeping these things in mind from beginning to end. So let's consider a scene, right? There's no light whatsoever. We know that there's the ground here and we know that there's the ball here, but because there's no light, we can't actually perceive any of it. And so when we decide that we're going to actually add in our ball, it doesn't technically have a light source yet, right? We just have the outer silhouette of a sphere here. But once we add in some lighting, we can see that what the light did by coming in and us not adjusting much else is it created that divide between light and shadow, and it created a cast shadow. Again, we're keeping things super simple for now. Now the next step that I'm going to add is going to be the halftone. And you can see it's really subtle when I switch back and forth between here. But what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to maintain this sort of soft line that's acting as a transition between the light and shadow, while also having some fall off from the center light. Then I'm going to add in the highlight. And you can see the highlight's super subtle in this area. And really, I'm just eyeballing it based off of the angle that we're viewing this from the camera's perspective and wherever I think the light source might be coming from, just up in this direction probably. Then I'm going to add the reflected light. So you can see here, light's shining past the object. And as the light is shining past the object and hitting the ground, it's bouncing up and it's adding a little bit of light to the back of the ball. And then finally, I'm going to be adding the ambient occlusion. Now, the other thing I'm going to be adding in this is ambient light. Now, the reason that I'm adding ambient light in this is because in most circumstances, there is some form of ambient light. It's technically a secondary light source, but it's so common in every scene that you should probably start considering how it's affecting your object. And how ambient light might be affecting your object, it's probably going to be lighting up the upper part of your object. And it probably will also light up some of your cast shadow. But the important thing to keep in mind here, and this is something I see a lot of beginners end up messing up, is that ambient light, more often than not, does not affect the actual primary light source shining on the object. Now, this can change. If the ambient light from above is stronger and has a higher intensity than the direct light shining on the object, then chances are the ambient light is going to actually affect the brightness of the direct light. Or even if they're close, right? You might see some color shifting, you might see it up the brightness a little bit, but it doesn't often happen. I kind of find that it's difficult to show this type of principle on a super smooth rounded object, especially when talking about that cutoff between light and shadow. I think that's usually what throws people off. So I find it's really helpful to end up using more of like a blocky segmented object like this. When you see an object like this, you can clearly see where these different sides are being cut off at. But you can really clearly see where that cutoff between light and shadow exists. And this is what's happening to a super smooth object like that sphere, or like, you know, a person's arm, or whatever, any rounded sort of form that you might paint. It's just happening on such a smaller level that we just don't see it as clearly as we see it on objects like this. And you can see even as I start removing all the other aspects like the highlight, the halftone, etc., you still have this really, really clear read between light and shadow. Now you might be wondering, how does this affect all materials? This is great and all, but the ball looks like a little rubber ball, or it looks like it's plastic, or, you know, skin almost. It looks too smooth, right? How do you do something like rock or metal or wood or anything like that? Well, shut up and I'll tell you. All materials fall on this grid here. I'm sorry, I would credit whoever made this grid. It's super, super useful, but I actually don't know where I got it from. But this grid is tracking two aspects of materials. Those aspects being specularity and glossiness. There's one other aspect to consider, and that's transparency. But that's a whole other thing, and we'll get into that. But you can see that glossiness and specularity is a sliding scale on both ends, right? You don't necessarily need to have an object that is super, super glossy, therefore it's super, super specular, right? Now, what these things mean is glossiness is essentially the smoothness of an object. What I kind of compare this rightmost one to that you can see most clearly is kind of like a cue ball that you might see, where it's super, super smooth, but its colors are still very, very true, and it's not very reflective. And specularity is the reflectiveness of an object. But just because something is reflective doesn't necessarily mean that it is glossy. A good example of this is like really, really rough chrome, right? Or a rough metal. It's something that normally is really, really reflective, and it still is, but because it's sort of rough, you're not seeing those reflections and the same accuracy that you'd be seeing them on a much glossier, smoother object. Now, I don't get super precise with a chart like this. I'm not in my head thinking, oh, this is a 30% glossiness and a 40% specularity or whatever. But I do think it's important to consider what an object's glossiness and specularity is. It's mostly important to be able to understand that that is an attribute that is a part of every single material that's out there. So if you're out there trying to paint something like wood or metal and it's just not quite looking right, you're kind of able to go back and consider, okay, well, like what's the glossiness of this? What's the specularity? Maybe I need to not have such precise highlights here. Now, when I talk about this glossiness and specularity thing, I think a lot of it can feel super overwhelming to a lot of new artists. And so I want to kind of put it in simpler terms. If we go back to our example here of just basic sphere with light, right? If you want to try and make an object appear glossier, all you need to do is have its highlight and its reflected light be sharper or not as sharp. So by going through and just adding a slight amount of sharp edge around the highlight and around the reflected light, you can see it's already giving the impression as if it's a lot smoother, as if it's a lot glossier. But otherwise, I haven't changed anything else. I haven't touched the halftone, I haven't touched the core shadow or the ambient occlusion or anything like that. And it's because the highlight and the reflected light, like I said earlier, they are direct reflections of a light source. Now, I mentioned the other thing to consider is translucency. So translucency is something to consider because really it's just how thick or thin is the material and how much light is the material able to take in and spread around inside of it. But what's good to consider is that glossiness and specularity still also apply to objects that have translucency. This is why you could find something, you know, like a thin rubber or something like that, or like gum. If you see someone blowing a bubble with gum, it's not super sharp and shiny and glossy, right? It's very dull. But if you were to look at something maybe a little cleaner, maybe like just glass, right? Like a glass orb or something, that might be very shiny. Sometimes you can see some that end up having a lot of glossiness, and sometimes you can see some that don't have a lot of glossiness, and it's going to change just how sharp those highlights and reflected lights appear. All right, okay, but now I'm sure you're looking at this and you're like, okay, fine. There's specularity. That's the reflectiveness of an object. There's glossiness. That's how smooth an object is, right? But what if you're just doing some of the basics? What if you're just working on stone? What if you're working on wood? What most people get hung up on is texture. Now, I think it's a really common misconception for people to refer to something like what is a material study as a texture study, because those are technically two different things that you're looking into. The texture you could think of as the outer contours or inner shapes and silhouettes that are common with the type of material that you're painting. But a material is how it is reacting to the light. It's a combination of both that makes something convincing. So let's look, for instance, at this ball. This ball is very, very smooth, right? It has no texture. Or it's, if it has a texture, it's such a microscopic texture that we really don't see it and it's not affecting our perception of it. So you could think of it like this. If light's shining down on this object, it's just hitting it just fine, right? It's able to see the surface, it's able to make an impact, and it's creating light. But let's compare this to something that, might have a thicker texture to it. Let's look at something like wood. Now, on top of this surface, we might end up seeing a lot of bumps, a lot of ridges, right? You get this rough bark texture that's going all throughout the surface of that object. Now, when the light is trying to cast any sort of light onto an object, now what might end up happening is it might start passing by one of these ridges. And like we saw with the cast shadow, when an object is being lit, right, it's going to then also cast a shadow out in that direction if it's blocking light from getting past there. So as this bark texture is being lit, it's also casting a shadow down that way. Some ridges might not be casting shadows. Some ridges might be smaller, like this little bump here, in which case that maybe is more of a halftone, where you can still see a transition between that and the center light, but it's not being completely cast into shadow. And this is how you can imply texture. All you have to think about is you have to think about what is the surface material and how is the light hitting that surface material. So let's draw that out. Let's see what that looks like. Let's just add wood texture on top of this, right? So all I'm doing initially is I'm just making a lot of large shapes. And it's okay if I'm cutting some of this light off up here because I'm going to add that back in. I'm going to make sure that all this still fits along the form principle. So this is so far the shape of that surface material, right? Now I'm going to paint back in that divide between light and shadow. And this time I'm going to start considering how is this light affecting all of these crevices in here? Well, it might cast a shadow as it starts hitting this ridge. Maybe it's casting a shadow down as it's rounding back around here and here. Maybe this is going in at such an angle that it's starting to go into halftone as it's angling downwards. In fact, a lot of this, because of the angle that it's at, it's probably not going to be in shadow, but a lot of this probably will be reaching into halftone. So I don't want it to be as dark as shadow gets, right? I don't want the value of it to be as dark as that. But some areas might end up cutting into shadow, like back here. Now I can start adding in a highlight. And again, this is where I'm going to be thinking about the glossiness and the specularity. If we're trying to paint wood here, it's probably not going to be super specular. It's probably not going to be super glossy. It's going to be a really dulled out sort of a material. So it's going to be a very subtle highlight. Now that highlight is still going to exist on all of these other small objects. If we look at this zoomed in version, these areas right here might be catching highlight depending on the angle that we are viewing them at. So what I tend to do is I tend to add in a bit of a highlight, and then if I think it's too strong or I feel like it needs to be dulled down, then I can just dull that down. Even within these shapes, I'm going to add smaller extra divots in there. Now, this is from a lot of experience of painting wood in the past. I've looked at a lot of different types of textures. And the other thing you might notice when a lot of texture ends up being added in is you might notice that as it starts to pass the terminator, some areas back here might be popping up and still be getting caught with light. So you'll see that a lot in this transition, where you'll see a lot of extra texture start to come through. Again, all considering the form principle. That's what this is. This is a plane on the texture that is still being caught at the angle that the light is being shown to us at. Now, the other thing that might be happening is that it might not be completely rounding out and going smooth. So what I'm going to kind of do is make a lot of little divots, maybe little scratches here and there. And that's going to block the light and then return it to either a center light or a highlight, depending on the angle that we view it at. I also wanted to do this in using just a hard round brush to show you that you can achieve this texture without needing to use any sort of special brushes. Because it's not necessarily the brush that's going to get you this look. I think that's something that I see a lot of younger artists doing. I did it all the time, where I find some brush and I'm like, oh, that looks like a wood texture. Now I can paint wood. And that's just not really how that works. Not if you don't know what you're doing. Now, I would use probably a textured brush for something if I were working on this for, you know, a client or a project. What I would primarily be using is some of those smaller details. So a lot of these little lines that kind of get that little divot of a detail. Now, again, this is what I'm considering a small little dip in the texture that isn't going into full shadow, but is probably just being caught by the halftone. So we're able to see it, right? We're able to see that little bit of detail. But it's pretty time consuming doing all that. So yeah, I would probably use some sort of a textured brush to try and get that look. I recommend anyone that's doing this for the first time though, or learning this type of a thing, just to be using a hard round brush to see if you can capture that texture. And now that I've painted this a little bit more, I think some of the highlights are getting a little bright, so I'm going to dull those down. And there you have it. Now, it might sound a little bit complicated to some people that aren't familiar with this type of stuff. That's totally normal. It takes a long time to practice this stuff. This is also technically like second level type of stuff to even be considering. If you aren't familiar with values of understanding things in grayscale, if you're not understanding drawing on a good level, then this stuff is going to be even harder for you to understand. But every material comes down to these things. Every material exists within the form principle, has all those elements of lighting that we talked about, and they all have, on a sliding scale, some level of glossiness, specularity, and transparency. If you consider those, and you consider what the actual shape of the texture is, and how that interacts with the light, you should be able to figure out how to paint any material you want. Wow, wasn't that an informative video? I don't know. I haven't actually... I filmed these before I filmed the rest, so... I sure hope it was good. Thank you, everybody, for coming and checking out another video. I hope it was helpful. If it wasn't helpful, feel free to dislike this. You could unsubscribe. You could start a 4chan thread about how you think I'm dumb or bad at art or whatever. Like, go ahead. Do it. But if you did like the video, feel free to like, subscribe, tell people about it. I don't know. Do whatever you want. And this is me, signing off. Until next time.